The bookmark wall held 212 names on the morning everything changed. Eleanor Marsh counted them every Tuesday before the library opened, the way some people count rosary beads, not for the number but for the steadiness the ritual provided. She stood at 7:45 in the morning with her coffee cooling on the corner of her desk, the overhead fluorescence still off, only the amber work lamp casting its circle across the checkout counter, and she moved her eyes slowly down the rows of laminated paper rectangles that covered nearly every inch of the wall behind her chair. 212 bookmarks. 212 children who had completed the full reading year. 212 names written in her careful block letters, and beneath each name, a quotation chosen by the child copied by Eleanor. Laminated and pinned to the wall on the last Friday of June when the summer program concluded, and the children held their certificates, and their parents took photographs, and the room smelled of the grocery store sheet cake she ordered every year from the same bakery on Millbrook Avenue. This morning she had one to add. Amara had turned in her final reading log the previous Thursday. 12 years old, quiet in the specific way that quiet children are when they are thinking far more than they are speaking. Amara had chosen her quote from a novel she had read in March, a book about a girl who crossed a river alone at night and arrived somewhere no one expected her to survive. The quote was 7 words. Eleanor had written it in her best hand the night before, pressed the laminate carefully at the edges, and now she climbed the short step stool and found the open space she had left at the end of the 3rd row and pressed the pushpin through. Amara and then those 7 words. Eleanor stepped back down. She looked at the wall for a moment longer than she usually did. Then she turned to her desk and opened the folder she had been building for 11 weeks. The Cedarville Reading Initiative annual funding presentation was tabbed and organized with the precision of someone who had done this 9 times before. 9 years of presentations to the Cedarville City Council. 9 years of line items and outcome data and cost per child calculations. 9 years of the same question from the same council member about whether the program could be consolidated with the county reading program, and 9 years of Eleanor's same patient answer, which was that the county program served children who were already reading above grade level, while her program served children who were not, and these were not the same children, and consolidation would eliminate the children who needed the service most. 9 years of the council voting to fund it. The program ran on $62,000 annually. The city spent more than that on parking meter maintenance. This year, a proposed 12% cut. She had prepared for it. She always prepared as though the outcome were not certain, even after 9 years of the outcome being certain. The folder held 22 pages. She had rehearsed her presentation until it ran 14 minutes precisely. She would be 4th on the agenda. She was not worried. The library smelled as it always did in the early morning of old paper, and the particular floor wax the cleaning service used on Mondays, a smell that had over 23 years become so thoroughly associated with safety and purpose in Eleanor's nervous system that she could not have identified it as a smell at all. It was simply the smell of where she was supposed to be, the smell of a place that worked. 23 years she had been behind this desk. She had watched children arrive who could not find the correct shelf without help, and she had watched those same children years later bring their own children to the summer program. The work compounded the way interest compounds slowly, and then suddenly in ways that could not have been predicted from the first deposit. She thought about the 41 children on the waiting list as she looked at her folder. 41 families who had enrolled their children and been told next year. The waiting list had existed for 7 years, which meant that somewhere in Cedarville there was a child who had been told next year so many times that next year now felt like a different country present on a map, promised in a conversation never quite arrived. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Marcus Webb arrived. He was 15 years old and had been coming to after-school sessions at the Cedarville Public Library for 3 years, which meant Eleanor had watched him move from the hesitant 12-year-old who sat in the back row and declined to read aloud when his turn came to the young man who now arrived carrying a book he had already started. Sat in the front row chair without being directed and waited for the younger children to settle before he began reading to them in the measured, unhurried voice he had apparently developed by listening to Eleanor read for 3 consecutive years. He read to them today from a collection of short stories. The younger children, 7 of them, ages 8 through 11, sat in the reading circle with their knees pulled to their chests. And Marcus read, and Eleanor sat at her desk and listened without appearing to listen, turning pages in her folder, adding a note to the section on outcome data, and thinking that Marcus Webb had one of the best reading voices she had heard in 23 years of this work. Unhurried. He did not rush toward the end of sentences. He let each word finish before beginning the next. It was the quality that separates a reader who has been taught from a reader who has understood. You could not teach it directly. You could only model it consistently over a long period and wait to see if someone absorbed it. Marcus had absorbed it. When the session ended and the younger children left and Marcus was packing his bag, he paused at the door. He asked her if the presentation was tonight. She said it was. He said he hoped it went well. She said she did too. She said it would. She believed that. She had presented 9 times. She had prepared. The folder was complete. The program was vital. The numbers were clear. She believed the outcome would be what it had always been because the argument was the same argument it had always been, which was that $62,000 served 180 children annually at a cost per session that compared favorably to every comparable municipal literacy program in the state, and the alternative was a waiting list that grew by 41 names every year that funding was cut. It was a reasonable argument made with documented evidence. She believed in documented evidence. At 6:15 that evening, across the lobby of Cedarville City Hall, Rosa Delgado was setting up her monthly live stream. Rosa ran a Facebook page called Cedarville Parents in the Loop, which she had started 4 years ago because she noticed that most of the parents she knew could not attend city council meetings. They worked evenings. They had children who needed to be fed and bathed and put to bed. They were the parents whose children attended the programs that the city council funded or cut, and they almost never had a seat in the room when those decisions were made. So Rosa came every month with her phone on a small, flexible tripod and propped it on a chair at the back of the chamber and went live at 6:30, and parents watched from their kitchens and their cars and their living room couches. And sometimes they texted Rosa questions to ask during public comment, and sometimes they just watched. Tonight she had already received 14 messages from parents asking her to make sure she covered Agenda Item 4. She propped the phone on the chair. She adjusted the angle so it could see the full podium and the council table and a portion of the front row. She opened the live stream. She greeted the people already joining. Then she took her own seat 3 rows forward and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Eleanor was in the front row, her folder open on her knee, reading her own notes one final time. She was 4th on the agenda. She was not worried. She did not know that Officer Cole Maddox had been asked to come tonight. She did not know who had asked him. She would not find out that night. Maddox was 36 years old and had been a patrol officer with the Cedarville Police Department for 9 years. He had 2 prior complaints in his file from black residents, both dismissed. He knew they had been dismissed. He thought about them sometimes the way people think about near misses, with a specific private relief that the record was clean, that the complaints had gone nowhere, that the system had done what he believed the system was supposed to do when complaints were filed without sufficient evidence. 6 months ago, Eleanor Marsh had filed a 3rd complaint. The circumstances were these: Maddox had encountered a 15-year-old boy named Devon Clark outside the library entrance on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Devon was sitting on the library steps with a backpack. Maddox had stopped and demanded his identification. Devon had explained he was waiting for his mother. Maddox had remained. Devon's mother had arrived within 4 minutes and told Maddox her son was waiting for her, that he had done nothing, and that she would like them to be allowed to leave. Maddox had continued to ask questions. The exchange had lasted 11 more minutes after the mother's arrival. Eleanor had witnessed it through the library's glass front door. She had stepped outside. She had asked Maddox if there was a matter she could assist with. He had told her this did not concern her. She had waited on the library steps until Maddox left. She had filed the formal complaint that evening. The complaint had been dismissed, but the complaint had required Maddox to appear before a review panel. The review panel had asked him questions for 45 minutes. The exchange had been documented. A record existed that had not existed before Eleanor Marsh stepped outside those doors and stood on those steps and waited until he left. Maddox had not forgotten this. He had thought about it on many shifts and many evenings, the specific irritation of having to sit before a panel and answer questions because a librarian had decided to involve herself in a police matter. The specific resentment of being reviewed, documented, filed. He had thought about it when the complaint was dismissed, and he had thought good. He had thought now it is done. He had been wrong about that. Tonight he came through the side door of the council chamber at 7:14 in the evening. The council was working through Agenda Item 3. Eleanor was in the front row. Her folder was on her knee. She heard the side door open and glanced up, registered his uniform without registering who he was, and returned to her notes. She was fourth on the agenda. Her turn was coming. She was not yet afraid. The trouble began the way most trouble begins in rooms that were supposed to be safe, with something small, something that could be mistaken for a procedural concern, something that arrived before anyone had time to understand what it was. The mayor's aide, a young man in a gray suit whose name Eleanor had never learned in 9 years of coming to these meetings, stood and interrupted her at the 42nd second of her presentation. He held a printed page. He asked about a line item discrepancy in the program's administrative overhead. The number he cited was incorrect. Eleanor knew it was incorrect because she had prepared this folder for 11 weeks, and the number he was citing was from the previous fiscal year's draft, not the submitted final report. She began to explain this. She was aware at the edge of her awareness that the side door had opened while the aide was speaking. She did not look. She continued speaking. She explained that the figure the aide was referencing appeared in the draft document submitted in February, but that the final submitted report, which the council had received in April, reflected the corrected number. She opened to tab 7 and held up the page. Cole Maddox was standing 6 feet from the podium. He had moved through the chamber while she was looking at tab 7. He was not wearing a look of anger. He was wearing the specific expression of a person who has decided something and is in the process of carrying out a decision already made, calm, deliberate, forward-leaning. She recognized him now. Something moved through her that was not fear and was not calm either. It was the feeling of understanding something in the instant before you can put words to it. He said, "Ma'am, you need to step down." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "I am in the middle of a presentation to the city council." Maddox said, "You're in violation of council conduct procedures. Step down from the podium." He did not specify what violation. He did not cite a procedure number or a municipal code. He used the word violation the way people use words that are meant to sound official without being required to be specific. Eleanor looked at the council table. The city clerk, a woman named Patricia Horton, who had been city clerk for 14 years, and who Eleanor knew by name and by the way she organized her papers into color-coded folders at the start of every meeting, had risen from her chair. Patricia Horton said clearly, "Mrs. Marsh is within her allotted presentation time. She has 42 seconds remaining on her initial 3 minutes." The council chair, Gerald Bates, who ran a hardware store on the east side, nodded at Patricia Horton's statement and made a gesture with his hand that appeared to mean, "Please continue." Maddox had not moved. Eleanor turned back to the podium. She held her folder. She was thinking without allowing herself to think it fully that this was manageable, that the clerk had spoken, that the council chair had nodded that the process was intact. The mayor had not spoken. Mayor David Halsey had been mayor of Cedarville for 6 years. He had won his first election in part because of the voter registration work done through the library's civic engagement programs. He sat at the center of the council table with his hands flat and his eyes on Maddox. The aide sat back down. Maddox took 1 step back from the podium. Eleanor understood this as a pause and not a withdrawal. She opened to page 3. She continued, She was explaining the cost per child figure, $12.40 per reading session when averaged across the program year, which compared favorably to every comparable municipal literacy program in the state. The chamber was very quiet. Rosa Delgado was watching Eleanor. Not her phone. The phone was propped on its chair 6 rows back, its lens open, taking in the podium and the back of Eleanor's head and the edge of the council table, and if the angle held the movement of a uniformed officer in the near distance. Rosa was watching Eleanor, the way you watch someone walking across ice, not because you expect them to fall, but because you cannot look away. The mayor looked at his phone. It was on the table beside his papers. He picked it up. He looked at the screen. Some expression moved across his face, something too brief and too contained to read from the front row. He set the phone down. He looked at a point somewhere between the podium and the exit. 30 seconds later, Maddox moved again. He stepped forward. He placed his hand on Eleanor Marsh's arm, not gripping, not pulling, but the specific placement of a hand that intends to guide and will, if not obeyed, intend something more. He said, "Ma'am, you've been asked to step down." She had not been asked to step down by anyone with the authority to ask her. She had been asked to step down by a man with a complaint in his file, a complaint she had put there. She said in a voice that did not waver, "I will leave when my presentation is complete." Maddox said, "You're going to leave now." The city clerk said, "Officer, this is a council proceeding." The council chair said, "Officer, please." Maddox did not look at them. He said, "Step down, now." And Eleanor Marsh picked up her folder. She closed it. She stepped back from the podium. She walked. She walked through the full length of the chamber. She walked slowly. She was not hurrying. She would not hurry. She had been coming to this building for 9 years, and she would walk through it at the pace at which she chose to walk through it, regardless of whether a man with a hand on her arm wanted her to move faster. The hand had dropped when she began walking. She had felt it leave her arm, and she had kept walking, and she had not looked back. The chamber was 72 feet long from the front podium to the rear exit doors. Eleanor had never measured it, but she knew it intimately in the way you know the dimensions of a place you have spent time in by the number of paces, by the way sound behaved at certain distances from the wall by the landmarks along the rows. The first 3 rows were for council staff and regular attendees. The middle section held the community seats, 12 rows of 6 chairs each. The back 2 rows were for overflow. The aisle ran down the center. She walked the aisle. She passed the first row. Patricia Horton sat with her color-coded folders and her face turned carefully to her papers, the deliberate not-looking of someone who has objected and been overruled and is managing the specific combination of professional restraint and private fury that comes from occupying that position in a public forum. Eleanor walked past without looking at her, and Patricia Horton did not look up. She passed the second row. In the third row, a man named Gerald Park, who ran the dry cleaning service on Maple Street, and whose daughter had completed the reading program 4 years ago, rose slightly from his seat. His hand came up in the instinct of a person who wants to stop something. He did not touch Eleanor. His hand was half extended in the air, and then it was not because there was nothing it could do now, and he sat back down and Eleanor kept walking. In the fourth row, a woman Eleanor knew from the parent council at the elementary school reached out and touched Eleanor's hand as she passed a touch so brief it might have been accidental. A touch that said, "I see you," a touch that said, "I am sorry," a touch that said nothing useful because there was nothing useful it could say. Eleanor felt it and kept walking. Her chin was level. Her folder was under her arm. Her footsteps were steady on the tile floor. She was thinking about the wall. She was thinking about the specific order of the bookmarks, the rows she had built over 23 years. The names she knew by heart. Not the 212 of them in total, but the specific ones in each row. The first one she had ever made for a child named Isaiah, who was now 31 years old and worked in construction, and who had 3 years ago brought his own daughter to the summer program sign-up. She was thinking about Isaiah's bookmark in the first row at the far left. her handwriting younger than it was, now the letters slightly less certain. She was thinking the wall will still be there when I get home. The folder will still be on my desk tomorrow. The program will still run its sessions at 3:30. She kept walking. In the 5th row, Diane Webb watched. Diane had driven to this meeting directly from her shift at the hospital, still in her scrubs, and she had arrived in time to hear Eleanor begin her presentation, and then heard the aide interrupt, and then heard Maddox's first words, and she had felt her hands tighten in her lap. She was thinking about Marcus at 3:30 that afternoon in the library, reading to the younger children in his careful voice. About Marcus asking Eleanor if the presentation was tonight, and Eleanor saying it will go well. About the way Marcus trusted Eleanor Marsh with a completeness that Diane recognized as rare and slightly fragile and worth protecting. She watched Eleanor walk. She watched Eleanor's chin. The chin did not dip. Not once. Not in the first 20 feet of the walk, or the second 20, or the last 10, before Eleanor pushed through the rear exit doors with her folder under her arm and her footsteps completely steady. The door swung closed. The chamber was silent for 3 full seconds. Eleanor's folder was still on the podium. She had picked it up to close it, and her finger had caught on the edge, and the pages had spread, and she had to choose between fixing them and walking with dignity. And she had chosen walking, and so the folder was still on the podium, open to page 3. The cost per child figure visible at the top of the page, the outcome data visible below it, the pages turning very slowly in the air from the ceiling vent. The council chair cleared his throat. He called a recess. Rosa Delgado did not reach for her phone. She sat in her row and looked at the podium with Eleanor's folder on it and thought about the phone 6 rows back with its lens still open, still recording an empty podium and an open folder, and the specific image of a public space from which a person had just been removed. She thought about the 14 messages from parents who had asked her to cover Agenda Item 4. She thought about the comments already arriving in the live stream chat. She had not been watching the comments because she had been watching Eleanor, but the comments would be there. The parents asking what just happened. The parents in their kitchens and their cars typing into their phones while children moved around them, and the evening continued, and the council moved on to the next item. She thought about the phone on the chair. She thought about what the phone had seen and what she had seen, and the difference between them. The phone had seen what was visible, what was in its frame, what could be captured by a lens pointing at a fixed angle, at a fixed subject. She had seen Eleanor's face. She had seen the moment Eleanor understood who was walking toward her and what he intended. The phone had not seen that. The phone had seen everything else. That would be enough. Eleanor was in the hallway beside the water fountain. She stood with her back against the wall and breathed. The hallway smelled of cleaning product and carpet, and the particular stillness of a public building after hours. She held nothing. Her folder was on the podium. She had never once in 9 years left her folder on the podium. She had the precise, slightly surreal thought that she needed to retrieve it. She breathed. She told herself the recess will end. The council chair will call the session back. Patricia Horton will say something. Gerald Bates will allow the presentation to continue. The vote will happen. The program will be funded. She had been coming to this building for 9 years. The process was intact. It was temporarily paused, but it was intact. She stood by the water fountain and waited. She heard the recess end through the closed chamber doors. She heard the muffled sound of the council chair speaking. She heard voices. She pressed her hand flat against the door and listened. She heard Agenda Item 5 being called, not Item 4, Item 5. The agenda had moved on without her. Her folder was still on the podium, and her presentation had 14 unspoken pages, and the 41 children on the waiting list were still on it, and the vote had not happened, and the agenda had moved on without her. She stood in the hallway with her hand on the door for a long moment. Then she pulled her hand away. She walked to the main entrance. She pushed through it. She walked to the parking lot and got in her car and put her hands on the wheel and sat there for several minutes without starting the engine. The September air came through the slightly open window. She could smell cut grass from the park across the street and exhaust from a passing truck. She sat with her hands on the wheel. She thought, I will come back tomorrow. I will find a way to come back tomorrow before the deadline. The deadline is 5 o'clock. There are 17 hours until 5 o'clock. The process is not over. She started the engine and drove home. Rosa Delgado drove home at 9:15 with her phone in her pocket. She had ended the live stream at 8:45. 40,000 people had watched the recording by the time she pulled into her driveway. The number had been 23,000 when she turned the live stream off, and it had continued climbing in the archived video. She sat in her car in her driveway and scrolled through the comments. Parents, teachers, people from other cities, other states who had shared the video without knowing Eleanor's name or the program's name or the name of the city. The recording had shown what it had shown: a uniformed officer placing his hand on a woman's arm in a council chamber, the woman walking the open folder on the podium, the mayor sitting at the center of the table with his eyes averted. 40,000 people had seen it. In the morning, it was 180,000, and the funding deadline was 5 o'clock. 3 families called Eleanor the following morning to say they were withdrawing their children from the program. They called between 8 and 9 a.m. before the library officially opened, while Eleanor was at her desk with her revised folder and the overhead fluorescents making their particular steady hum. She answered each call. She listened to each family. She heard the specific tone in their voices, not anger, not cruelty. Something closer to a particular fear. The fear of association, of being connected to anything that draws a certain kind of attention, of having their own children become visible in ways they could not control. Eleanor understood this fear. She had watched it work in the community for 23 years. It was not irrational. It was a calculation made by people who had reason to calculate. It hurt the way it always hurt when the calculation was made against the program, against the gathering, against the visible thing. But it was a kind of hurt she had learned to carry without letting it change the shape of the work. She thanked each family. She said she understood. She said she hoped they would return when circumstances allowed. She hung up the third call and sat for a moment. She looked at the wall. 212 bookmarks. The work was the wall. The wall was still there. She thought about each of those 3 families. She knew the families, she knew the children, she knew the specific bookmarks on the specific rows that belonged to those children. She knew that the children had not made this decision, that the children were not afraid of the program, or of Eleanor, or of each other. They were the least afraid people in the equation, the ones who arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at 3:30 and sat in the reading circle and chose their quotes. The fear belonged to the adults who calculated. She understood them, and she was sorry for the calculation they had to make, and she hoped they would come back. She thought they will come back. When the funding is secured and the program continues and the months pass and the police review board has done its work, they will come back. The children will come back. They are on the waiting list. They have been waiting. They will come back. She opened her revised folder. She thought about what it meant to revise. She had been building that folder for 11 weeks. 22 pages. She had spent a Saturday in August at the kitchen table with printed drafts and a red pen and a cup of tea that went cold twice before she noticed. She had spent a Sunday in September reading outcome studies from comparable programs in 4 states, looking for language that would make the argument more clearly than she could make it herself, and finding that she could make it more clearly herself. The folder had been a complete and sufficient document. It had been the truth organized. What she was doing now, trimming it to 12 minutes, removing the sections she had worked hardest on, because she did not trust she would be allowed to finish them. This was not revision in the sense she meant when she helped children revise their writing. This was accommodation. She knew it was accommodation. She was making it anyway because the deadline was 5 o'clock and the 41 children were on the waiting list and the work required whatever it required. The attorney had told her what she had already understood: the removal was technically lawful. She had known this on some level before she called. She had called because she needed to hear it said by someone who knew the law, because she needed the ground to be established before she could decide what to do on that ground. The ground was no emergency recourse. The ground was file a complaint. The ground was 17 hours. The library board chair had suggested postponement. She had thanked him, and she had understood his logic, and she had decided against it in the space of 30 seconds because she knew what postponement meant in concrete terms. Another month, another meeting, another presentation. The waiting list staying at 41 names for another month. The families who had already been told next year being told next month also. And another month after that, another opportunity for something to go wrong. Another opportunity for the process to be interrupted by a man who had decided the record she had created about him needed to be answered. No, she revised the folder to 12 minutes. She removed the historical context section. She removed the comparison data from other municipalities. She kept the cost per child figure and the outcome data and the enrollment numbers and the demographic breakdown and the waiting list, 41 children. She put the waiting list number in the opening sentence and the closing sentence. It was the first thing she would say and the last thing she would say if she was allowed to finish. She read the 12-minute version through twice. Then she set it aside and made a second cup of coffee. The library opened at 9. The first patron through the door was an older man named Charles who came every Tuesday and Thursday to use the reference computers, and who had never in Eleanor's knowledge checked out a book, but who had over many years become the kind of regular whose absence would be noted. He nodded at Eleanor. She nodded back. He sat at computer 3. The morning proceeded. At 11:47 across town at the Cedarville Police Department, Sergeant Frank Dolce was in the parking lot beside the dumpsters when Officer Cole Maddox came out the back door with a coffee mug and a thermos. Dolce told him the old complaint, the one filed after Devon Clark, was expiring from the active file this month. The review period had ended. It would be archived, which meant it would exist but would not be counted in any current assessment of Maddox's record. Maddox refilled his mug from the thermos. He looked at the dumpster. He said, "Good. It should never have been filed." He said she had no standing. He said a librarian calls the police on a police officer for doing his job. Dolce said nothing. Maddox said, and now this second thing. Dolce said, "This one has video." Maddox said, without looking at Dolce, "Complaints get dismissed." He said it the way a person says something they have said enough times that it has stopped being a sentence and become a fact, a feature of the landscape as reliable as gravity. Dolce stubbed out his cigarette. He went back inside. Maddox stood in the parking lot with his coffee and the September light on his shoulders and was not worried. He did not yet know about the 180,000. In the Cedarville Middle School library, Marcus Webb had been sitting since 7:50 in the morning. He had sent the messages the night before. His mother had come home from the council meeting while he was doing homework at the kitchen table, and she had sat down across from him and told him precisely and calmly what she had seen. She had not raised her voice. She had the tone she used when she needed to tell him something difficult, while also modeling for him how to receive it, not with panic, not with explosion, but with the stillness that comes from understanding that the response to a thing matters as much as the thing itself. When she finished, Marcus had sat for a moment, and then he said, "Did she finish her presentation?" His mother said no. He said they moved on without her. It was not a question. He said it the way a person says something when the implications are arriving faster than the words. He had sent the messages at 9:30 p.m. He had been careful. He had not used the word protest. He had not used the word demonstration. He had said Mrs. Marsh was not allowed to finish her presentation last night. "I am going to the school library tomorrow morning to read. You can come if you want." 12 children came. They had their bookmarks. Every one of them had their bookmarks. Some had carried them in their pockets, some in their backpacks, and one girl named Sophia had kept hers in the front pouch of her binder for the entire year since Eleanor had given it to her, the laminate slightly worn at the edges from being handled. They came in through the school entrance at 7:45 when the building opened, and they walked to the library, and they sat in a circle near the periodical shelves, which was the same configuration Eleanor used at the Cedarville Public Library for after-school sessions, and they opened their books. They sat, they read, they held their bookmarks. Priya Anand. The school librarian had looked at them when they arrived. She had looked at the bookmarks. She had understood immediately what this was and what it was not. It was not a disruption. It was 12 children in a library doing what libraries are for holding the physical evidence of what a library had given them. She had gone back to her desk. The room was very quiet. The particular quiet of people reading, which is different from all other quiet, inhabited, purposeful, the quiet of minds at work. At 9:15, Principal Robert Peel walked in. He stood inside the entrance and looked at the 12 children in their circle. He looked at their faces. He looked at the bookmarks. He looked at Marcus, who looked up. Marcus said, "We are reading and we are not in anyone's way." Principal Peel said nothing for a moment. He was a man who had been a principal for 11 years, and who had seen many things in school buildings, and who understood in this moment that he was looking at something that required witnessing rather than intervention. He took his phone from his pocket. He said, "May I take a photograph?" Marcus looked at the others. They looked back. He said yes. Principal Peel took the photograph. He left. He did not call their parents. He did not send them back to class. He walked back to his office and sat down and looked at the photograph on his phone. 12 children in a circle holding laminated bookmarks, each bookmark bearing a name and a chosen quote. The periodical shelves visible behind them, the morning light coming through the high windows and landing across their faces and their open books. He sent the photograph to the mayor's office at 10:58. He did not add a caption. He did not need to. The photograph said what it said. It said these children know what they owe. It said they know where they learned to read and who taught them, and they know that it is in danger. It said they came here with their bookmarks because the bookmarks are what they have that is theirs, the physical evidence that they completed something, that they were there, that their names are written on a wall in the handwriting of someone who believed they could do it. The caption, if there had been one, would have said, "Look at what $62,000 built." But there was no caption. The photograph said it. He sat at his desk and waited. Diane Webb called Eleanor at 11:40. Eleanor had been at her desk since 7. She had answered the 3 withdrawal calls. She had revised the folder. She had opened the library at 9 and helped Charles at computer 3 and shelved returns and answered 2 reference questions and thought about the deadline and not thought about it and thought about it again. She had been keeping her hands busy because keeping her hands busy was the only version of staying calm that worked under a certain kind of pressure. When Diane's name appeared on her phone, she answered on the second ring. Diane told her what Marcus and the children were doing. Eleanor was quiet. She looked at the bookmark wall. She sat behind her desk in the amber circle of the work lamp, with the overhead fluorescents on and the September light coming through the front windows. And she looked at 212 names in her own handwriting. And she thought about Marcus arriving at 3:30 for 3 years. And she thought about the specific quality of his reading voice. And she thought about 12 children sitting in a circle in the school library at 7:50 in the morning, because a woman they trusted had not been allowed to finish a sentence. She did not cry. She kept herself from it not by suppressing the feeling, but by moving through it and past it to the other side, which was the side where the work was. She said in a voice she kept very steady, "Tell Marcus to stay as long as he needs to." She paused. She said, "Tell him thank you. But say it like it's ordinary, because to him it is ordinary. Tell him I'll see him at 3:30. She hung up the phone. She opened her folder. 12 minutes, clean and complete. At 11:53, Principal Peel's photograph reached the desk of the mayor's chief of staff. She looked at it for a long time. She picked up her phone and put it down. She opened her laptop. At 12:01, a local television station received the image and called the school for comment. At 1 p.m., the image was picked up by a national wire service. The caption that ran with it read, "12 children sit in their school library holding the bookmarks from their reading program the day after the program's director was removed from a city council presentation by police." The image spread. It spread because it was not an abstract image. It was a specific one. 12 specific children, their names visible on the bookmarks in the high-resolution version, their chosen quotes legible if you enlarged the image. A girl with a quote about rivers, a boy with a quote about light, Marcus Webb with a quote. Eleanor would not read until later. Each bookmark a record of a child who had been somewhere and done something and chosen a sentence that mattered. The specificity was the thing that made it spread, not a symbol. 12 names. At 2:17 p.m., Eleanor's phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Patricia Horton, the city clerk." Eleanor answered. "Patricia Horton," said Mrs. Marsh. "I want to tell you first that what happened last night was wrong, and that I said so at the time as clearly as I was able, and that the council record reflects my objection." She paused. She said, "The council has voted to reopen the hearing. We would like to offer you the podium at 4 o'clock this afternoon if you can come." Eleanor looked at her folder. She said, "I will be there at 3:45. The chamber was full in a way that city council chambers are not usually full on a Wednesday afternoon. Eleanor arrived at 3:47. She walked through the lobby marble floors, the particular echo of a building that takes itself seriously, and pushed through the main chamber doors and stopped for a half-second to take in what was there. Every seat was occupied. She could feel it before she fully processed it, the specific warmth and sound of a room with too many people for the chairs. People were standing along the rear wall. People were standing in the side aisles. She recognized faces, the man from the print shop on Hollander Street, who had donated laminating supplies to the reading program for 6 years, who nodded at her when she walked past. The woman from the public school cafeteria, whose daughter's bookmark was on the wall in the 3rd row. The couple she knew from the library's Tuesday morning toddler reading hour, who had no child in the reading program and had come anyway. Teachers from 3 schools. The young man from the County Literacy Coalition, who always attended the annual program review meeting and who was standing against the right wall with a notepad. Rosa Delgado was in the front row. Her phone was in her lap, live. The view count was passing 200,000. She had gotten here at 2:30 and taken the front row seat because it had the best angle, and because she understood in a way she could not entirely articulate that tonight was the meeting she had been setting up her monthly live stream for 4 years to eventually cover. At the back of the chamber, at a table near the rear exit, a woman in a gray blazer was writing in a notebook with a recorder open on the table beside it. She was from the state capitol. She had driven 2 hours. Eleanor took her seat at the front. She placed her folder on her knee. She held it with both hands. She was breathing steadily, and her hands were still, and the room was very loud, and then it began to quiet as the council chair took his place. Gerald Bates called the meeting to order at 4:02. He said that the council had voted unanimously to reopen Agenda Item 4. He said that Mrs. Marsh would be given an uninterrupted opportunity to complete her presentation. He paused on the word uninterrupted. He let it sit in the room for a moment. He said, "Mrs. Marsh." Eleanor stood. She walked to the podium. She was thinking about the morning she had laminated Amara's bookmark. She was thinking about the step stool and the pushpin and the 3rd row and the 7 words Amara had chosen from the novel about the girl who crossed the river. She set her folder on the podium surface. She adjusted it. She looked at the council. She said 41 children are currently on the waiting list for the Cedarville Reading Initiative. They are waiting because the program is full. They have been told next year. In some cases, they have been told next year for several years. I am here to speak for the 41 children who are not in this room, who do not have a voice in this chamber, and who do not yet have bookmarks on a wall. She said, "I would like to tell you what they are waiting to enter." She presented for 12 minutes. She was not interrupted. Not once. The chamber was very quiet in the way it had been quiet the previous evening, but it was a different quiet, the quiet of attention of people deciding to listen, of a room that had assembled with the specific purpose of hearing something through to its end. She moved through the cost per child figure without pausing. She moved through the outcome data, the reading level improvements, the attendance rates, the completion percentages. She presented the enrollment numbers and the demographic breakdown, and the comparison to other municipal literacy programs in the state. The comparison she had removed from the first revision, and then added back because it belonged in a 12-minute presentation, and she had removed it only because she was afraid of being interrupted. And tonight, she was not going to be afraid of being interrupted. She presented the waiting list last. She said 41 children are waiting. They are waiting for a vote. They are waiting for the answer to the question of whether what they need is worth $62,000. I have tried to answer that question for you in the preceding 12 minutes. I believe the answer is yes. I have believed it for 9 years. I believe it now. She closed her folder. She stepped back from the podium. The chamber did not move. It was not metaphorical. The room held one of those silences that happen very rarely in public life, the silence that follows when something has been said so exactly and completely that the room needs a moment to absorb it. Not applause. Something before applause. The breath held collectively. The council chair looked at the mayor. The mayor was looking at his hands. 3 seconds. The council chair said we'll go to a vote on agenda item 4. The vote was 5-1. Full funding. No cuts. $62,000, the same as 9 years before. The one dissenting vote was the mayor. He voted no without speaking. He looked at his hands when the result was announced. He did not meet Eleanor's eyes. He did not meet Rosa Delgado's eyes. He did not look at the reporter in the gray blazer. The sound that came up in the chamber after the vote was not quite applause. Something more restrained, something that had been held for 24 hours and was now releasing with the specific, controlled relief of people who had not been certain until this moment that the thing they had hoped for was going to happen. Rosa was looking at her phone. 211,000. The council chair was not finished. He said the council was referring the conduct of Officer Cole Maddox during the previous evening's meeting to the Cedarville Police Department's review board for assessment of whether the removal of Mrs. Marsh constituted conduct inconsistent with department policy. He noted for the record that the Rosa Delgado footage would be submitted as part of that referral. He noted its current view count for the record. 180,000, he said, as of this morning's referral motion. He had not updated the number. He then said, I want to note for the record that Mrs. Marsh's objection during the incident was stated clearly, was supported by the city clerk's contemporaneous objection, and is reflected accurately in last night's session transcript. He said this looking at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded once. She was thinking about the wall. She was thinking about 41 children who would get there next year. She was thinking about going home and calling the families who had withdrawn their children and telling them the program was funded and asking if they wanted to return. She was thinking about tomorrow at 3:30. The review board convened 6 weeks later. They reviewed the Rosa Delgado footage, which had reached 420,000 views by that point. They reviewed Maddox's file. The 2 dismissed complaints, the Devon Clark complaint that had been dismissed but documented, and a 3rd complaint Eleanor had not known about at the time she filed hers. Harold Carver, a black resident who lived on the north side of Cedarville, had filed a complaint the previous year. He had been pulled over 3 times in 18 months on streets that led to and from his home. The same officer each time. Each stop documented. Each stop resulting in no citation. Harold Carver had filed his complaint and received the standard letter. He had kept the letter. He had kept copies of the traffic stop reports. The review board found a pattern. 3 pages, 4 years of documented interactions. Cross-referenced. Specific. The word pattern appeared in the formal findings document 7 times. Maddox was suspended pending review. The review took 11 weeks. At the end of 11 weeks, Maddox was formally terminated. The formal findings cited the 2 previously dismissed complaints, now substantiated under full re-review with the complete documented record. The Devon Clark incident, Harold Carver's 3 traffic stops, the council chamber removal, the pattern, The record that Eleanor Marsh had started when she stepped outside the library doors and stood on those steps and waited, that record had not ended when the first complaint was dismissed. It had not ended when the second complaint was dismissed. It had continued because records continue, because once a thing is written down, it exists in a way that a thing that is only remembered does not exist. She had known this. She had known it when she filed the first complaint and watched it dismissed and filed the second one anyway. The record had done what records do when enough of them accumulate. Eleanor did not comment publicly on Maddox's termination. A reporter called. She said the review board completed its work and reached its conclusion. "I hope Devon Clark and his mother see this. I hope Harold Carver sees this." She said, "I have a library to run." On the morning after the full funding vote, Eleanor arrived at the library at 7:45. She stood at the door for a moment before unlocking it. The September air was cool, and the sky was the particular clear gray that precedes October in this part of the country, a gray that feels clean rather than overcast. She unlocked the door and went inside and turned on the overhead fluorescents and stood at the checkout counter in the moment before the work lamp came on in the transitional light of the overhead fluorescents and looked at the bookmark wall. 212 names. Amara Ose, third row end of the line. 7 words beneath her name. Eleanor made her coffee. She sat at her desk. She opened her folder, the 12-minute version, and looked at it for a moment without reading it. Then she set it aside. She would file it. She filed every year's presentation in the third drawer on the left in the hanging folder labeled by year. 23 folders now. 23 presentations, 9 of them delivered to the council. 14 before that to various grant committees and foundation review boards and library association panels. 23 years of arriving in the morning at 7:45 to the smell of old paper and floor wax of standing at this desk and knowing where she was supposed to be. At 8:15, before the library officially opened, a girl knocked on the glass door. It was Amara. She was early. She had her backpack. She pressed her hand flat against the glass and looked through it at Eleanor with an expression Eleanor recognized the expression of someone who needed to be somewhere safe and had decided that this was the place. Eleanor unlocked the door. She said, "You're early." Amara said, "I know." She came inside. She sat in the front row chair and took out her book and began reading. Eleanor went back to her desk. She was thinking, this is what it is. This is the entire work. A girl in the front row chair before the library opens. The wall, the smell of the room. The work does not require any more than this to be worth doing. It never has. At 3:30, Marcus arrived. He came through the main doors with his backpack and his book, and he stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the wall the way he sometimes did not, reading the names, just taking in the whole of it. Then he sat in the front row chair vacated by Amara, who had moved to the reading circle, and read. After a few minutes, he looked up. He said, "I want to add one." He held up a bookmark. It was handmade, cardstock, not printed. His own handwriting careful and deliberate. The handwriting of someone who has learned to take care with letters by spending 3 years listening to a person who takes care with words. His name, Marcus Webb, and below it, a quote. Eleanor read it. "The truth does not require permission to speak." She looked at him. He said, "I wrote it myself." He said, "I couldn't find it anywhere." He said, "I kept looking for it, and it wasn't in any book I read, so I figured I must have meant something like it, but I couldn't find the exact thing, so I just wrote it." Eleanor looked at the quote again. She said, "Then it is yours." She got the step stool. She took the bookmark from him. She pinned it herself at the end of the third row next to Amara's. She stepped back down and looked at it. 213. 3 weeks later, she submitted Marcus's application to the State Honors Reading Program. She wrote the recommendation over 2 evenings, reading it through each time until it said precisely what she meant. She wrote about his reading voice. She wrote about 3 years of after-school sessions and the younger children who listened to him. She wrote one sentence about the school library. She wrote, I cannot think of a better demonstration of what we hope reading will do for a person than what this young man did with what reading gave him. He was accepted. The acceptance letter cited Eleanor's recommendation specifically. He brought the letter to the library on a Thursday and set it on the checkout counter without saying anything, the way people present things they are proud of when they are too private to present them directly. Eleanor read it. She folded it and handed it back. She said, "I expected nothing less." A month later, a photograph was framed and hung at the library entrance. Principal Peel had taken the original photograph, 12 children in the school library, on a Wednesday morning. 3 more children had come to Eleanor the following week and asked if they could be in it too, and she had arranged a second photograph and had both composed side by side in the same frame. 15 children. Their bookmarks. Their names visible. Their chosen quotes readable in the high-resolution print. Every face looking directly at the camera. She hung it at the entrance to the right of the main door at the eye level of a 12-year-old. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went back to her desk. The work did not require commemoration to be real. It had been real before anyone outside Cedarville knew it existed. It would be real when the news cycle moved on. It would be real when the view count on Rosa Delgado's video stopped climbing and the reporter in the gray blazer moved on to the next story, and Cedarville returned to its ordinary Tuesday mornings and its funding cycles, and its council meetings where most things were decided without ceremony. The work would be real because 41 children were going to get there next year, because 213 bookmarks were on the wall, because Marcus Webb had a recommendation letter in his backpack and a quote on the wall that he had written himself because he could not find it anywhere, which meant he had needed to say it, which meant it was true. The truth does not require permission to speak. It does not require an audience to be true. It does not require a chamber full of people or a view count or a photograph framed at an entrance. It requires only that someone keep speaking it clearly and precisely with a folder prepared, and the cost per child figure memorized, and the willingness to walk through a room with the chin level and the folder under the arm and the footsteps steady, and then to come back. Eleanor Marsh had been coming back for 23 years. She had come back on the mornings when the funding looked uncertain, and the mornings when the waiting list grew, and the mornings when a complaint was dismissed, and the mornings when she stood at the bookmark wall and counted names and understood that the counting was not a record of success, but a record of continuing, of showing up, of the door opening. She would come back in the morning at 7:45 to the smell of old paper and floor wax. She would stand at the wall and the count would be different from the day before. Higher, always higher, the wall filling slowly the way walls fill when people keep adding to them. She would make her coffee and open her folder, and the library would open, and someone might be at the door before it did, pressing a hand against the glass, and the door would open. That was the entire thing. The door would open, and Eleanor would be there. 23 years, 213 names, 41 children who would get there next year. The door would open. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this one where the record kept running, where truth arrived before the window closed, and where dignity outlasted every attempt to silence it.